The cooking in itself is, of course, rewarding, but it's really the experience when people get to eat the food and talk about the food and see the food for the first time. It's really that's really what's my biggest reward, and that's also, of course, what's been desperately missing for the last 2 years at stages, especially the last few months.
This is the Deep in the Weeds podcast. I'm Anthony Huckstep. Themed restaurants were very much a thing in the 80s and 90s in Australia. Often naff, kitsch, sometimes in tourist traps, but rarely a positive culinary journey. But as with everything in life, there are always anomalies. Inspiration for a venue can come from just about anywhere, and when someone manages to capture the essence of an idea and deliver above expectations, it becomes something quite special. Joachim Borenius is the head chef of Mjolner in Sydney. Joachim, how are you?
I'm well, thanks.
You're the head chef of a Thor-inspired restaurant dishing up Viking feasts. That's something a little bit different.
Yes, it most certainly is, but it's also, of course, very close to home, being born and bred in Sweden. It felt like a very natural fit when I first stumbled across the product.
It's quite a interesting venue. Tell us about the concept and the idea behind it all.
Well, the Speakeasy Group, which is the owners and creators of Mjolner, are owned and run by Sven Roger Almenning, who's a Norwegian, but also Greg Sanderson, who's based down in Melbourne. And the idea behind having a venue inspired by Norse mythology and named after Thor's hammer was a way for Sven to kind of grasp a hold of the mythology that comes around the Norse mythology and kind of put it into a venue that could escape time and place and just walk into a venue that just transcends you into a completely different place. So the idea was just to take a step back in time, basically, and when I came on board after a few months of the restaurants being created, it really felt like hand into the glove fit, like we say in Swedish. And I just started cooking straight away, of course, and it's mainly inspired and driven by Scandinavian heritage style cooking. A lot of it is inspired flavors from Scandinavia. But of course, all the produce is Australian, so it's a bit of a way of cooking Scandinavian style techniques with Australian produce as well.
It's quite an incredible venue to walk into. I was fortunate enough to do that early on when it first opened. Take us through the front doors and what it's like to experience the restaurant as a diner.
So the venue is based in a basement in Redfern, in what used to be an old tobacco factory. So as you walk down the stairs, we have the front of a longship facing out of the wall onto the guests. So as you walk down if you look just up north, straight up, you can see a big ship. And a lot of people actually tend to miss it because it is dimly lit down there. So it's a bit of a surprise for those who haven't seen it when we tell them we have a ship in the foyer. But and as you come down, there's a big metal curtain with a depiction of Odin. That can be seen like a little curtain, and then just straight to the left we have, of course, candlelight, but a big welcoming table where the host is greeting the customers that are arriving in. Slightly behind the desk, we have the open kitchen, which is where I work from all services. We're plating all the food, all the hot food at least, on the pass. So that's a bit of an interactive experience. A lot of people that are sitting in the main dining room section can see and interact with us if they so please, in a bit of an open kitchen environment. But the actual kitchen is just behind it.
Tell us a little bit about Scandinavian cuisine and then what your representation of it is here.
Well, I think to narrow it down, the Scandinavian food culture is very much inspired by years and years of cooking with seasons. So it's been a way of making sure to preserve the bounty of summer to last through autumn and preserving again the autumn stuff that's still available to carry you through winter. So it's been a lot about pickling, fermenting, salting, curing, all the kind of stuff that allows you to store and eat through the winter. Because traditionally, of course, especially in the north of Scandinavia, the winters are very harsh, so nothing really grows. So it's a question of what you manage to stow away into your cellars that will carry you through the winter. And that's kind of a style of cooking that I really appreciate. Of course, being born and raised with it, you have a different appreciation for when things are actually in season. And asparagus will only taste as good as it does in the early months of the summer, and same with the strawberries. And they have a very special flavor and therefore a special place in our hearts. I think for a chef, it's like getting to get your grades exactly when you want them, because that's how your seasons are driven. You really have delicious and fantastic potatoes one time of the year, and they are served almost as a dish by themselves. So for a chef, it's to me, it came very natural to be driven by the produce-driven food, that it's very simple and kind of humble, peeled back, but also, puts the focus on the chef really to create out of the humble ingredients, which is something that I quite like.
What's it been like using Australian ingredients that aren't necessarily available in Scandinavia with this approach to cookery? Has it changed the way that you construct dishes?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot of the stuff that we have in Scandinavia is either not available in Australia or quite different here in Australia. And same goes, of course, for a lot of the Australian produce. So that's been quite an interesting journey of seeing sometimes Australian produce that remind you of something from back home. And it's pretty funny then to take an idea of a dish from back home and translate it into Australian produce, often with a bit of a hint, a bit of a, I'm not sure what the expression would be, but it's a bit of a tongue-in-cheek play on those dishes. So, for instance, herring is one of those staples in Scandinavia that we have in abundance, or had especially in abundance, particularly in the earlier years of the century, but historically. And that's been one of those fishes that you can't really get in Australia, even though the herring is quite similar. There's a few fish that can translate all right to it, but I've been using kingfish because I think it's a fun product to play around with, and therefore I've been trying to find ways of curing and pickling, and without losing the integrity of the quality of the product, of course, because exposing fish to white vinegar and salt and sugars can be traumatic if you're not being respectful. And I think that's been one of the fun things for me, to take the Scandinavian heritage and translate it into both fine dining environments through the Marque restaurant. And
take us back to when you were young. You were born in Sweden. What role did food play in your family? And is there any sort of feasts that you remember that you can share?
Yeah, I mean, food was extremely important for us in the family. I think that my mother never really had that experience when she was growing up. So she really wanted to make sure to make it a bit of a tradition in our family. So we had a very religious gathering around the dining table and ate delicious meals together. And especially for weekends, that would be consisting of often 2 and 3 courses. And we would all be helping each other out to cook, because it was more fun that way. And as soon as you had skills to do one thing, you started learning something else. And as soon as you started getting trusted in the kitchen, you could pretty much get away with anything. So we had a lot of fun cooking growing up, and we still, to this day, whenever we get together, we end up cooking. I have 3 siblings, and they cook quite a lot with their families as well. So it's been one of those family heritage things that's been passed on in generations that I'm really grateful for.
What lured you to become a chef?
I can only say that that's the family. I thought it was a lot of fun to play around with flavors. I really enjoyed serving food to customers, to guests, to family, and tweak recipes, get them better. It was just always something that came very natural to me. We had a big garden, and especially through the summer and autumn, we had a lot of bounty in the garden. It was red currants and apples and plums and all kinds of different gooseberries and all kinds of different vegetables and stuff that we were growing in the garden. So it was a pretty natural thing. I just fell in love with it basically, and I was cooking from a very early age. I continued to cook, but because I wasn't really sure what I wanted to be when I was growing up or when I was an adult, I was kind of, persuaded, is probably the wrong word, encouraged, I would say, to pursue other careers. So I was studying engineering after my military service when I was lured into a kitchen and was cooking at a student organization. It's a bit of a fraternity, not American style, but it's a bit similar. We were members of this social club, and I was cooking. First, I was cooking once a week, and then that was slowly becoming more and more frequent. And after a jazz festival in 1999, I was cooking South American food with it's not South American, American South, rather, food for a jazz festival with this chef that came from Washington. And we hit it off straight away, and I was cooking pretty much 24/7 for a week, and I was completely blown away with how much fun food can be. And that's kind of when I decided that engineering wasn't as much fun as cooking was.
You've worked at some pretty incredible restaurants in your career. What's been the real important stepping stones for you?
I think for a long period of time, growing up as a chef, and I mean growing up as a chef, it was a question of seeking challenges. I've always been intrigued by people that push the boundaries and create their own rule books. So after being trained in the kitchen and starting cooking, I was always the one with the annoying questions that the other chefs couldn't answer. I was wondering why I had to put water in the water bath when you cooked a creme brulee, because they couldn't really explain it. They just said, you just have to. And that kind of reminded me of my math teacher when I was younger saying that this is the way you do it. It's like, well, that doesn't really satisfy my curious mind. So at an early stage, I was driven to find out more, and I ended up actually studying a bachelor in culinary arts. And that's when I came across, and that's when about the time that Heston Blumenthal was making a name for himself over in England. And that's how I ended up working for Heston Blumenthal in 2005 at the Fat Duck, learning how to prepare the snail porridge and all the dishes that he became very famous for. And I think that was a big eye-opener to realize that there was many ways of approaching cooking, and not necessarily a right or a wrong way, but with physics in mind and a bit of a curious mind, you could be quite creative with food. And that's something that I've taken with me since then and always enjoyed in my cooking career.
You also spent some time at Per Se, Thomas Keller's restaurant. Do you have any stories of that time?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say the first time I really was struck by Thomas Keller's qualities as a chef was when I was recommended to get the French Laundry cookbook as a friend of mine, as a chef. One of the first restaurants I worked in who spoke of him highly. And after seeing that cookbook, I was completely blown away with who he was as a chef and what that meant. And it wasn't really until later in life when I actually came across an opportunity to work for him. That was in 2009. Early 2009, I started working for Thomas Keller at Per Se. And he's the executive chef for Per Se. There was the local chef was Jonathan Benno. And that was a very big brigade. Pretty much there was a lunch and dinner operation, but the chefs would start very early in the morning for the lunch shift. It was an interesting experience, I have to say. It was very meticulously run. Thomas Keller and Jonathan Benno both had family backgrounds in the military, so there was a military precision and character behind a lot of the things that were done there. A friend of mine who was at the time was a sous chef, he was referring to this. It's a bit of like joining a cult, because it's a very strong culture in play, and you do better to be swept away by it, basically. And I have to say that I learned a lot from my over 6 months working at per se, but I don't really know if the culture agreed with me to the degree that it could have. I think that I would have been more malleable as a younger chef. But it was a very fascinating experience. And to say that he's working with some of the world's best products is, of course, very, very inspiring. And to see the organization behind it all has made sure for me that my fridges are always very organized and clean and labeled and all that stuff that kind of is inevitable. If you work for Thomas Keller, you're always reaching for your green tape and your scissors and your Sharpies to make sure that everything is labeled. And it's really extremely helpful, of course, because it's one of those things you don't have to second guess where things are because you know where they are and you know they're in the right quality. And it's one of those fundamentals that stayed with me. It was a very fascinating.
This episode is proudly supported by OpenTable.
Nearly 1/3 of diners are booking same day. So they're making those decisions on the spot. And 10% are making their bookings within just a few hours. And so it's why it's so important to have booking software like OpenTable, which allows your diners to discover you. And so when restaurants are on platforms like OpenTable, they're much more likely to be discovered. We help diners to connect to restaurants. Ultimately, having technology, using technology, helps you to reattach to those diners.
Experience the power of OpenTable. For an exclusive offer, visit restaurant.opentable.com.au/DITW.
Experience.
What led to you coming down to Australia?
It's funny. I have been trying to figure out why Australia was in the cards for me so early on. But I think that when I was actually back home in Sweden last January in 2020, early 2020, and I was going through one of the old boxes of relics that were put away in my mother's attic when I found 5 drawings with haikus that was in a task we were given when I was probably 12 years old. And I had written 5 haikus and drawn 5 different themes, all with Australian themes. And I had no idea why I did that. It was just one of those things that it just felt like a fascinating country far, far away with a lot of deadly animals and fast with sharks and dingoes. And it was just one of those things. And I could have been through some kind of early childhood memories of, I don't really know what I've seen. I must have seen some kind of childhood. Maybe it's documentaries about nature or something, but it was always in the cards for me. And I was always interested in coming down here. And I was talking so much about Australia that a lot of my friends beat me to it. So I had friends who came down to Brisbane and studied down in Brisbane because of my strong strong desire to make it down to Australia. And unfortunately, I didn't make it down here while they were still here because they're back in Sweden now. But I ended up coming to Australia 2006 when I had finished up my degree in culinary arts. It was time for an adventure, and I figured it was time to see Australia. So I came to Sydney in 2006, late in the year. It was October or something, when I stepped into Marque restaurant and met Mark Best, but also met Pasi Pettanen, who was the head chef at Marque at the time. And his sous chef was named Reuven. He was a German chef as well. So I stepped in and I felt at home straight away. I was only supposed to be in Sydney for about, over the summer was the plan, for 3 months at least, but I ended up staying for 6 months and really quite enjoyed cooking in Australia, but also cooking with Best and the guys in the kitchen.
Why did you feel like you were at home in that kitchen with Pasi and Mark?
I think between Mark's dark sense of humor, we had a very good connection straight away, me and Mark. It was just one of those situations when you meet somebody, you know that you've either known them for a very long time already or you're going to know them for a very long time moving forward. So it was just one of those meetings that you felt had a true significance. But of course, Pasi being Finnish, our cooking history isn't that dissimilar. And he had been working a fair bit in London as well. So we had both fine dining background and training, and we had the Scandinavian heritage in the background. So it just felt natural straight away to cook. We had similar ideas and approaches to things. And when people would scratch their heads and wondering where the ideas came from, I could see the red line going through it all and just really understood it. It's a bit like a musician, and you can get into a song by hearing what the other instruments are playing, and you just know what to do. Everything just fell into place, basically.
It was Marque was one of Australia's most influential restaurants for over a decade, with a tiny little kitchen and incredible alumni. What did you take out of the experience there?
I so many things. I mean, I cooked for. I was at Marque in 2006, and then I came back in 2009 after my stint at Per Se, and stayed at Marque Restaurant for 5 years. So I was there until 2014. And that was the head chef when Pasi left. So I was sous chef, and then I was head chef. So I've taken a tremendous amount of experiences from that time, and a lot of connections as well. Like you said, there's an incredible alumni from Marque Restaurant.
You're also involved with Pay Modern, which was Mark Best was at the helm of. Tell us about that experience and how different that was compared to Marque.
I think the product Pay Modern, I had a lot of faith and respect for. I really loved cooking with that under the brand of Pay Modern, and I think that it was a great product. I really enjoyed cooking. What was a bit more of a bistro version of Marque Restaurant would be, but being fitted inside the Four Seasons, of course, had its own expectations for the customers, and I feel that. A great product that I was very proud and excited to work with, but perhaps something that the Four Seasons diners weren't really understanding of. But we had some great times. I was really happy. I was there for, I think it was 2 years at the Four Seasons.
Tell us about Mjolner. How did you get the job at first, and how much of it changed after you got a hold of the keys to the kitchen?
I would say that there was through my time at the Four Seasons, I got to know Alexandra Dallenberg, who was the venue manager at the time when I joined Mjolner, and we were working together at the Four Seasons. So when I knew that or heard that she was getting involved with a Viking restaurant, I kept hinting at her, wondering when she was going to hire a real Viking chef. But it wasn't until the restaurant that I was then working at, Bush, failed in October, I think it was 2016, 17? 17. It was 2017. That's when I joined the ranks at Mjolner, and I met Sven for the first time at a cafe just around the corner from Mjolner, and I sat down, and he saw that I have Mjolner tattooed on my hand, and basically said, well, you're wearing the brand already. Tell me what you need from me for you to join the team. So we had a pretty funny first connection, and we had a great connection from the first go as well when I met Sven. And we were just talking about, what the restaurant was hoping to achieve and what it was about. And I feel like I took that concept and ran with it because the format was there, the pillars were there, and it was just a question of filling that canvas with paint. And having this Scandinavian background that I do, it's always been natural for me, and it's both been a fun way of taking humble products to new levels, using Mjolner as a brand now instead. So it's kind of there's a sense behind it all, which is kind of fun to see that my Scandinavian background has gone full circle from being really back in the early 2010s when Noma first came on the big scene, and everybody was talking about Scandinavian cooking, and it was just fun to be a part of that, and that revolution that kind of swept through. And now to see it and it's back towards its own original form is really fun. So I'm having a lot of fun cooking at Mjolner, and very proud of what we created.
Well, tell us a bit about a Viking feast or your interpretation of it. Is there a dish or two that you can tell us about that kind of really epitomizes what you're doing as a chef?
I feel like what makes Mjolner special is a bit of there is a bit of theater behind it, of course. And like you said in the early introduction, is that themed restaurants is one of those things that are a bit misunderstood, and it's something that hasn't been particularly common in modern days. There's been more with those back in the 70s or 80s, perhaps. But I say it in New York, they're alive and well. And I have seen so many themed restaurants do very well because you're allowed to be a little bit different. You don't have to play by the same rule book that everybody else does. So I think that the atmosphere and the restaurant and the simplicity, but also brutality behind the dishes is one of those things that comes together in a perfect symbiosis. I like to cook a lot of game, a bit of a hunter-gatherer vibe on a lot of the dishes that we're doing. But we also want to keep people comfortable and not be too provocative. But there's room for both. So there's comfort and there's a bit more provocative style of cooking. So I have this dish that's a braised venison shank that we source out of South Australia. That's a wild shot that I'm really proud to use because, of course, it's an introduced species and a bit of a pest. So we like to try to use those products to shift focus from the normal meat industry and do something a little bit different. And it's braised, and then we use the braising liquids and make a beetroot sauce. So the shank, it's served with a beetroot glaze that kind of looks a bit like a blood and bones pile, really. So I like to be a little bit dramatic with the visuals. And I think that's one of those things that's kind of, there's an ethos behind it, but there's also, of course, people, especially in Australia, are quite fond of beetroot. So it's a way of making people comfortable, but at the same time being a bit provocative. Another dish that we're really quite well known for is the roast bone marrow, which is a split femur bone from a cow that we roast and blowtorch and serve with different garnishes depending on what year it is, really. We have been using fermented mushrooms for a while now, and we'll be doing so when we reopen as well, which is just around the corner. And it's just mushrooms. It's mushrooms and toast, really, but with a split femur bone. And then we have fermented mushrooms, and there's a roast mushroom powder. And so I like to take techniques and put them back into simplicity. So you get a lot of flavor and perhaps not really sure why things are so tasty as they are, but there's a few little chef's trick up the sleeve that you can make use of.
You mentioned that you went back to Sweden at the beginning of 2020, just before the whole world experienced this pandemic. What sort of impact has the last sort of year and a half had on you?
It's been an interesting experience to be pushed away from your craft in the way that I feel that I was when restaurants were forced to close. Of course, having cooked professionally for over 20 years and always going from job to job, which I have been, in the few times that I've been unemployed, it's usually been in between jobs has been a pretty short experience. So being forced to kind of sit back and think about what you're doing and how you're doing it and how you'd like to do things differently when you reopen has been a bit of a blessing, but also a bit of a frustration, I have to say. Of course, the unknown is difficult. And again, now with this current lockdown that's lasted over 3 months, has been, again, a bit of a welcome break, perhaps, because the months that we were open in between were pretty chaotic and a bit understaffed. But it's been an interesting experience to kind of step back from your craft, think about what you're doing and what you like to achieve with your next coming years professionally, and where you hope to see yourself in the future.
What sort of impact did that have on you? Will you be approaching your craft differently as a result of what's happened?
I think that if anything, my beliefs have been enhanced, restored. I think that I owe it to myself to push myself creatively, but also kind of have a meaning behind the things that I'm doing. Chefs always make a big effort when they choose produce, and kind of put that ethos back into what I'm cooking and how I'm cooking it will definitely be a big part of what I'm doing moving forward. To choose sustainable proteins and even be inspired by, I have a friend in Copenhagen who runs a famous restaurant called Amas, and his name is Matt Orlando, and he was, before he opened Amas, he was the head chef at Noma, and he's been a good friend from our years together at the Fat Duck. And they have taken the carbon neutral footprint thing to a whole new level, and have banned all cling wrap in the kitchen, and they're very conscious about their carbon footprint. And as much as it's a big thing in Scandinavia, it's something that I think that we can learn to glimpse at when it comes to being here. Like when I first joined the restaurant, we were cooking a ton of short ribs per month. And that's not exaggerating. That's actual numbers. It was a ton of short ribs every month going through that kitchen, and I felt that as happy as I was for the customers, as soon as the beef prices started getting affected by COVID and all the things that were going, even before when the droughts were hitting Australia, it was just one of those things that was exponentially putting us in trouble financially because it was such an expensive product, and people weren't really willing to pay what it actually costs. So I've been having a lot of fun looking at alternative proteins for different reasons. So anything from wild rabbits to venison to you name it, basically, to have a little look at spreading people's preferences out from what they think they just want a steak on the plate to leave the dining room talking about how delicious the broccoli was and not understanding why it's so delicious. And I'm happy to tell them that it's a bit of Vietnamese fish sauce on the deep fried Brussels sprouts. So the deep fried broccoli, when it comes out of the fryer, makes for a massive umami explosion, but also a bit of a flavor that resonates from home with salted fish. So it's, yeah, I think that will just, if anything else, I'm just encouraged to be more, bit bolder, perhaps, a bit less comforting and more not necessarily provocative, but there's more to pull out of this book of rhymes, and I feel like it's time to challenge myself as well as the customers.
You've worked at some amazing restaurants all over the globe, and now one of the most influential chefs in Sydney with a really busy restaurant. What is it that you love about what you do?
I have to say this the energy of it all. It's such a moving machinery. When you're standing on the pass on a Saturday night and we're doing anywhere up to close around 180 covers, it's a pretty good energetic place to be, and you're surfing on this high of a successful service. And it's so funny because the things that were inspiring and exciting to me when I was a young chef has of course changed over the years, and I feel like the connection I have today with my staff and all the customers that are there experiencing our product is really what keeps me motivated and keeps me going, doing what I'm doing. The cooking in itself is of course rewarding, but it's really the experience when people get to eat the food and talk about the food and see the food for the first time is really that's really what's my biggest reward. And that's also of course what's been desperately missing for the last 2 years at stages, especially the last few months.
There's a bit of light at the end of the tunnel with New South Wales announcing a roadmap to opening up restaurants again. How are you feeling about that, and what are you looking forward to?
I am extremely excited to be getting the band back together and to get back into it and to get customers through the door, basically, and to be able to give them that special experience, showing them what Mjolner is about, and also getting people to sort of leave the outworld problems behind them and just step back in time. We have, for the past, since early 2000, we changed. We used to be playing a lot of 90s rap in the dining room because we felt like that was a fun contrast to what we were actually doing. But over time, we felt like it was probably about time that we took a step back with the music as well. And we've been playing a lot of Norse-inspired music in the last year and a half, and it's made a massive impact on the theatrical experience of the restaurant. So it's very breathy and drummy, and there's a few bands that do really, really great Scandinavian-inspired music. One band is called Vardruna, for instance, and they're as really quite fascinating to see what that actually does to the product. So we're not ashamed of being different. We think it's fantastic. When I first came on board the restaurant, one of my goals was to be able to get a chef's hat and see that the food is, of course, up to scratch for the quality of that experience. But I think that we've still been eluded by the guides. But I have to say that the 700 to 800 customers that find their way through our door every week are speaking volume. So even if none of those are reviewers, we seem to be doing rather well. And I'm very excited about the fact that we are. And the people that come back are very, very excited to come through. We have some absolute diehard fans who have been eating in the restaurants close to 20 times and comes back with different friends all the time. And they're excited. So my birthday is finally coming up. We're coming in with a big group, and they reach out. And it's pretty funny because we have some diehard fans in the restaurant, and it's really nice to see. And it's kind of what keeps you motivated as well to make sure that you deliver that expectation and above and beyond it. It's like Thomas Keller was saying, when it comes to cooking in the kitchen, it's like, I don't really care about the reviewer on table 14. Like, I want to impress the guys on larder. And if I can cook food that blows their mind, I know for a fact that I'm going to manage to blow the mind out of the reviewers, because we know food better than they do. And we work with it in a different way. So he's just like, don't worry about that part. Just make sure the product makes sense to you and get the the engine running, and it'll all just fall into place. And I feel like that's what it's done. It's gone from clarity to clarity from when we first opened, and gone from strength to strength as well. So.
Well, Joachim, we've loved having you on Deep in the Weeds today to hear your story, and very much looking forward to you opening the doors and welcoming back those 800 people a week into the restaurant. Please keep in touch, and we'll talk again soon.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
This is the Deep in the Weeds podcast. I'm Anthony Huckstep. Stay tuned as we take a deep dive into the lives of the incredible people who ply their trade in the food and hospitality sector. Special thanks to executive producer Rob Locke for making this all happen. Follow us on Instagram at Deep in the Weeds Podcast, or email us at podcast@deepintheweeds.com.au. Stay safe and be well.